Hello, everyone. Welcome to Telum Talks 2. Now, today, Telum is talking to Sudhir Vadaketh, co-founder and editor-in-chief of JOM. JOM, for those of you who don't know, is a weekly digital magazine that was launched just this August, and they cover a wide range of topics from arts and culture to politics, business, and technology in Singapore. Sudhir, thank you so much for taking the time, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Now, can we just take you back all the way to August, or maybe even like months or years before that? What was the inspiration behind JOM, and was it, a long time coming? Like, did you spend a long time planning for it?
Yeah, I think it's been bouncing around at the back of my mind for many years. The idea that Singapore doesn't have a good literary long-form magazine. And, we've got the mainstream media, we've got the alternative media. I think there have been attempts in the alternative media to do long-form journalism, but they are sort of either scattered or different from what we actually had in mind. And so I think it's been, one of those ideas that's kind of slowly come to fruition over the past year and a half. And yeah, we started working properly on it, I would say, at the end of last year, end of 2021, slowly building the team and getting everything together. And we launched in August this year. So yeah, I think in a nutshell, the main inspiration is just the need to provide a good literary long-form magazine for Singapore. Right. And maybe one day if we grow big enough, Southeast Asia as well.
Wow, big dreams ahead. Now, when you say literary magazine, right, can you explain what exactly that entails, and why do you think there is a need for, such a magazine in Singapore now?
Yeah, well, I'll keep playing on the theme of big dreams. I think as lofty an ambition as it is, the closest analog that we're aiming for is something like the New Yorker for Singapore or for Southeast Asia. So that would be the easiest way for me to describe what we mean and what we have in mind. Why is there a need for it right now? I think there's always been a need for it, and the digital revolution in the last 20 years has changed the media industry in many ways. It's made it harder in some ways. It's also made it easier in some ways for people to access and produce content. I think if you look at Singapore's media landscape, you've got the mainstream media and you've got the alternative media, and they serve very different functions. The mainstream media, in many ways is just sort of focusing on daily news and very much towing the government line, if not parroting the government line. And I think the idea that as Singapore society has grown and developed and matured over the years, there's actually a real hunger for diverse alternative viewpoints that, actually can counter the government line or just in general add to the diversity of our intellectual thought and discourse. And I think some alternative media sites have attempted to do that, but I think, again, there are differences in the way we approach things, in terms of the people actually writing, the experiences they have coming into JOM, and also our basic approach to journalism, which I think, we try to take a much more slow, deliberate, careful approach to journalism, whereas a lot of the new media sites tend, no fault of their own, it's partly because of their business model, tend to be very incentivized by short-term engagement, short-term metrics, the need to constantly put out content.
Funny you should mention that, because I was actually wondering, right, your website states that JOM aims to inform and delight with slow journalism. And you also mentioned that quite a bit earlier. Do you think that people have the patience for slow journalism in this day and age, especially, with all the short attention spans? And by extension, can you tell us more about why you arrived at this editorial philosophy, so to speak?
I think slow journalism is more in terms of the way we approach the craft and the processes that we have internally. And, some of the things, and there are several publications around the world now who have professed their faith in slow journalism over the past 5 to 7 years, and in a way it's a rebuke to this fast-paced, short attention span type environment that we're now in, that's been again facilitated by the digital revolution of the past 2 decades. So let me give you some sort of values that we profess to, sort of being right over being first, delivering proper long-term analysis of events, producing original content and not just rehashes or what some people might call journalism, being succinct, and also investing very heavily in our editorial process. So let me just give you an example. When we commission pieces, we like to have a 2 to 3 month lead time before publication, and it's a very intensive process that we go through with our contributors. Many rounds of editing, and we've got a whole team, everybody from me as the editor to our head of research, who work very closely with contributors on their copy. And just to frame things in terms of Singapore, because not all of your audience might know, but there tends to be a sense that typically in journalism, when you submit your copy, it's a very hasty, fast process from the time a writer submits copy to the time it gets published. There's not a lot of engagement, there's not a lot of improvement of copy. And again, I think this is a function of business models that actually, a lot of teams just don't have the capacity and processes to be able to engage in that really heavy editorial process, which we want to do. It's not really something newfangled in a way. If you look at a lot of like old storied publications like the New Yorker, like the Economist, they actually have been adhering to many of these slow journalism principles, right? So it's not something new that's been created in the past decade. But I think what's happening now is that publications like Jom and others around the world, we are starting up in an era defined by fast journalism. We're starting up in an era where everybody, like you said, has short attention spans and doesn't have the time, and the incentives of the current media market means that a lot of journalists feel the pressure to churn out content. So I think slow journalism, it's this kind of fun word that we need to use now precisely because of the era that we're starting up in. It's not to suggest that nobody else professes their faith in them.
What has demand been like so far for your site, for Jom, at the moment? And how do you decide then what to cover and what not to cover?
We have about 2,400 newsletter subscribers right now, and we have about 400 paying subscribers to Jom. So we have 3 tiers of subscriptions, and we have about 400 of them. And just to put things in context, our break-even point we've calculated internally is about 3,500 paying subscribers. So we're about 1/8, 1/9 of the way there. And yeah, I mean, I'm quite happy with the growth so far, but I think it's sort of leveling off a little bit, and that we've gotten those early enthusiasts and early adopters on board, but probably from next year onwards, I'll have to spend a bit more time on marketing and pushing the publication. In terms of how do we decide what to cover and not cover, I think that's a really important question, something we have to balance, especially as a publication that produces very little content. So we produce 3, maybe 4 pieces of content a week, if you include our newsletter and if you include our roundup of what's been happening in Singapore. And so we have to be quite selective, quite deliberate about what we talk about. We need to both talk about the stuff that's really relevant and current in the national conversation, but we also want to talk about the stuff that nobody else is talking about, and I think that's important for a long-form publication to do, because we have the time and resources and capacity to be able to cover issues in a deeper way, than others can. So a recent example would probably illustrate it. We over the past 2 or 3 weeks, we've spoken about the HDB public housing issue in Singapore, and we did it through a short opinion piece, which talked about the way the government actually calculates its profit and loss when it sells these public housing units. And this was a really hot topic in Singapore over the last few weeks. So that would be, I think, our attempt at running with what's current and what's hot right now. But then we also did a piece where we looked at a very specific forest that's about to be destroyed in Singapore called Dover Forest East. So we wrote a longer form essay around that. We published a video, and that again was a piece that was many weeks in the making, a lot of deep research. We actually sort of interrogated the actual process of public consultation and public engagement between activists and the government. And that's the kind of piece that I don't think you'd see very commonly in Singapore. So if you look at the shorter HDB piece and the much longer Dover Forest piece, I think that's a good example of how we try to do a bit of both.
What kind of collaborations are you guys open to, right? Because I noticed that you're also calling for contributors on your website.
We're certainly on the lookout for writers, artists, specifically in photography or video or film, or we eventually want to get into podcasts as well. So anybody who can contribute, visual media artists. We've had numerous great illustrators creating nice illustrations that complement the essays that we write. So we're looking for all those sorts of people. I say Singaporeans, but it doesn't have to be Singaporeans. It could be anybody who's got an interest in Singapore as well. They could be based overseas. They could be non-Singaporeans based in Singapore. But we are at the moment just focusing on Singaporean issues. So whoever our contributors are, they would have to know a bit about Singapore and Singaporean issues. Now, in terms of the broader media ecosystem outside contributors, I do welcome deliberate, careful PR pitches, of course. Now, the issue with the PR agency is that they tend to be set up more for daily news sites, right? So they tend to send releases that might get picked up by daily news sites, and we are not a daily news site. So it's not, Jom is not going to publish updates on a particular industry or updates on a particular artist or something like that. But we might sort of like, if there's an interesting pitch around a long form essay, so like a 2,000 word essay, then yeah, of course I would love to hear from PR agencies as well if they've got ideas around that.
And how can they reach out? Did they just email you, or there's a form on your website, I believe?
Yeah, there's a form, or our general line is info@jom.media.
Then what's next for Jom, by the way? Is there anything new or exciting we can expect on the horizon?
We've got a whole series of postcards from Singaporeans based overseas. So I'm trying to slowly build a sort of nice stable of interesting Singaporean writers based overseas who can, send us quote unquote postcards, whether it's from New York or London or Paris or, smaller places like Siem Reap or Auckland in New Zealand. And I think this, this idea that being Singaporean is, not something that needs to be constrained to geography, right? So I think the experiences of Singaporeans abroad is also something very interesting. The little life lessons that they might pick up over there that somehow have resonance over here. So that's a whole postcard series that Jom is planning, and I'm slowly sort of reaching out to interesting writers abroad. I think at some point in the next year we'll probably commission our first podcast. I don't know how soon that will be, but we're sort of like bouncing around a few ideas right now. We've obviously just published our first video, which I urge everybody to watch. It's a 7-minute video on Dover Forest East. And I think more generally, we might also start doing a couple of pieces that are slightly outside of Singapore. So as an example, I'm thinking of commissioning an essay on the Malaysian election, which will be happening quite soon. So that's, going a little bit outside our geographical remit of Singapore, but I think that's the kind of thing that we have to start doing as well. In terms of other formats, we might start doing 1 or 2 events next year. So when I say events, like, sort of a panel discussion or something like that, we might organize a couple of Jom events where we, so for example, on housing affordability, we might have a morning session where we have, a few speakers talking about housing, and obviously in the longer term, events is a key potential revenue stream for organizations like ours, right? So that's something we also want to start slowly doing.
Very happy to have had the chance to speak to you today, Sudhir, and thank you so much again for taking the time and telling everyone more about Jom.
No.
We look forward to hearing more from you and more from Jom, and see you continue to expand, and maybe one day when you're regional, we'll sit down again for another chat.
Yeah. Thanks, Samjo. Hopefully the day comes soon.
Yeah. In the meantime, hey, let's do events with Telum. Yeah, why not?
Yeah. Sure, of course.
Well. All right. We'll be in touch. Thank you so much. That was Sudhir Vadaketh from Telum Media.